Hello, everyone. This is Randy Goers, and welcome to the Drone Radio Show podcast, episode 227. I'm on the last week of my vacation, so I'm republishing another popular podcast interview. If you're looking to attract investors, you'll want to listen to this podcast. I'll be back next week with a fresh new podcast interview.
This type of entrepreneur has got to be better. That software entrepreneur who's also asking for capital. At the end of the day, there's a lot of brilliant innovators. They're all over the world. They're in Eastern Europe, they're in Asia, you name it. They're everywhere. In my manner of thinking, the differentiation at the national level will be.
You're listening to the Drone Radio Show podcast, the show about drones and the people who use them for business, fun, and research. Hosted by Randy Goers.
What do investors look for in a drone-based business? For that question, we turn to Marco Rubin, Senior Investment Director at the Center for Innovative Technology in Virginia. Marco leads seed and early-stage investments in the aerospace, UAS, energy, and software sectors for CIT. And he serves as a board member and mentor to numerous portfolio companies. During his career, Marco has invested in over 200 early-stage technology companies. He's held leadership roles with funds recognized by Entrepreneur Magazine's annual VC 100 list, and he's managed various funds in information security technology, software, telecommunications, and medical devices. In this episode of the Drone Radio Show, Marco talks about the Center for Innovative Technology and what venture capital funds and investors look for in a drone-based business. But before we hear from Marco, I want to thank those of you who are supporting my funding campaign. Now you have the option of making a one-time donation in any amount by going to droneradioshow.com/donate. Whether it's $1, $100, or much more, you can help defray the costs of production and keep the podcast going and growing. And if you want to make a monthly contribution, you can still go to patreon.com/droneradioshow. Now let's find out what investors look for in early-stage drone companies with Marco Rubin of the Center for Innovative Technology. Let's pick up the interview where I asked Marco to introduce himself.
My name is Marco Rubin. I'm Senior Investment Director with the Center for Innovative Technology. That is a 501c3 headquartered by Dulles Airport in Northern Virginia outside of Washington, D.C. I'm part of an equity investment team that deploys capital into seed and early stage tech companies. In particular, I'm leading the investment area for aerospace and space, and we've been making deployment of capital into drones and low Earth orbiting satellite technologies and so forth. Some people call us venture capitalists. I'm effectively a seed and an early stage version of that person.
How long have you been doing this?
With the CIT, I've been involved with them since formation of the fund in 2003, so 15 years. Prior to that, I was a venture capitalist, and prior to that, I ran a corporate venturing shop for a Fortune 500. And then at one point in time, I was an aerospace engineer for NASA, so that's the pedigree.
When did the fund start investing in drone technology?
Drone technology investment is a fairly recent phenomenon, one that I've been advancing within the organization because of my interest and competence and belief that the area is a growth area. We started our first investment about 2 years ago, and we are in the process of investing in 2 more investments, in the one in the Northern Virginia area and another in the Norfolk Tidewater area.
What do you mean by early seed companies?
One way to think of what we do, because the name would suggest Center for Innovative Technology, part of our mission is to invest in high growth, high expectation companies that have some innovation content. And by that, we tend to be working pretty closely with entrepreneurs that are either from the university environment or spin-outs from federal research labs and, the classic 3 guys in a garage. And typically, when we invest, you would see us as one of what I would call the first institutional or first professional investors. So imagine friends and family and angels, and you'll see us be one of the very first risk-taking investors before the venture capital community comes in. And what we like to think of ourselves is as a feeder system for the VC world. So the kind of companies that we're involved with, we have an expectation, as do the people downstream from us, that these are going to be the kind of companies that you'll be reading about in the next few years, like Precision Hawk, et cetera. That's a typical venture-backed company. But in that case, much further along.
Do you actively look for companies, or do companies come to you in search of capital?
So it's a mix of both. We have entrepreneurs who recognize our name brand, and we have a pretty active search process. So there are a team of 6 investment managers, and I'm the one primarily focused on the aerospace and space segment. I work with a whole series of stakeholders across the Commonwealth. And one more detail that's probably worth noting, I invest in Virginia-based companies, though by deal volume, we're recognized as the largest investor in the Washington, D.C. area, as well as Virginia in general, not by dollar amount, but in terms of number of transactions and number of portfolio companies that we have in total, which if you also add our energy fund and our life sciences fund and our software fund, we're at about 250 companies right now. So it's a pretty mature portfolio.
Can you talk about the companies or the technology where you're currently invested?
Let me talk about the drone company that we're involved in and also the low Earth orbiting satellite company. They share a similarity. I tend to see many of these devices sharing a common characteristic. Low Earth orbiting satellites, in my view, are another IoT device, Internet of Things device. But for example, our drone company was spun out of NASA Langley. The company is called Advanced Aircraft. The entrepreneur came originally from NASA Langley, and we had been tracking his progress for some time. And their value proposition, it's not exactly what you would call your typical quadcopter. This is a very long duration, long flight vehicle designed to hover and dwell over a field of view that requires little to no setup by the operator. So essentially, the proposition when this was designed by NASA is to have a technology that could be operated in just minutes, turned on, flies vertically, the wings rotate horizontally, and then it essentially becomes a traditional fixed-winged aircraft at that point. So it's got a unique place in the drone world. There are many governmental, military applications, and as you might imagine, there are a lot of commonalities with this and some of the search areas that entrepreneurs have in this market for long linear infrastructure sorts of inspection. So, for example, bridges are required to be inspected every 2 years by the federal government, and dispatching work crews to these locations can be very expensive. And this is yet another tool in the arsenal to bring down the cost of maintenance for sort of critical infrastructure. So that has its pedigree in NASA Langley taxpayer-based technology. The second company, which just launched last week from Kennedy Space Center, is a company called Ubiquity Link. They are a low Earth orbiting satellite that's being deployed from the International Space Station that does narrowband communications. And that's about all I can say at the moment about what they do to honor the requests of the entrepreneur. But it gives you a sense of the types of risk that we take on. These are very early investments. We're ordinarily there pre-venture capital. There's still a lot of operational risk ahead, a lot of market risk ahead, but we see evidence that there's demand for these. So one of the criteria that we apply for these companies is, hey, is there a market for these technologies? And I think it's terrific that these innovations are pushing a boundary, but in our manner of thinking, you have to be economically sustainable. So we look for evidence of a market that's ready and customers who are willing to write checks for product.
Now, did I read correctly that CIT was involved in the drone integration pilot program?
So yes, the CIT was the prime entity that led the winning proposal for the Commonwealth of Virginia, along with a whole series of other stakeholders in the Commonwealth, including Virginia Tech. There's a Mid-Atlantic Aviation Partnership, MAP organization. There's a whole array of agencies in the state that were part of that. But yes, the CIT was the contractor that submitted the proposal and won that. And we also have a group of new executives who've been brought on board to staff a new center of excellence. So the long and the short of it is that we're standing up an organization purely to bring a whole series of UAS-related topics to the foreground in the Commonwealth. As you might imagine, there's a lot of cats that are in the process of being herded in the Commonwealth. And one interesting attribute of the Commonwealth, which I think is interesting, is that there is a real strong push, in addition to the IPP framework, to create what would call one common political subdivision for essentially national airspace for drone usage and policy creation along that lines. In other words, you don't want to have municipalities creating their own rules. And the view here is that we're doing our best to not only create one common framework, but clearly at the end of the day be aligned with DOT, FAA ambitions to create a very safe and essentially a one national aerospace system. So I don't know that that would be what's unique about Virginia, but it is certainly, I would say, one of the thought leaders in this whole IPP format, which is we're really looking for that sort of condition for entrepreneurs to create essentially a set of operating rules for value creation. And one thing I've learned about investing in almost a 25-year period of time in these high growth, high expectation companies is that investors require certainty, especially regulatory certainty. Imagine, for example, a medical device that didn't have regulatory certainty in the FDA side. That would certainly deter and frustrate investment. Same thing goes here. We think the greater the clarity there is on the regulatory side, the better conditions will be for attracting risk investors like us and others. So there you go. We're trying to create an environment that entices other people to come alongside with us.
You mentioned looking for clarity in the regulations. What does that mean?
Well, I'm not a policymaker, nor am I an attorney. I have my venture capital hat on. And essentially, when investors that we deal with in what's called this venture capital asset class, they typically, a venture investor has a fund that has a 10-year life. So they're bringing on their own investors who have an expectation of essentially that duration vehicle. And my view is we'd like to have companies that have essentially a business model that can profit during that period of time or longer. Imagine if, for example, you had a business model where it wasn't clear what certain air restrictions might be for one location versus another. Certain air taxi delivery services might be frustrated. Our view is there really needs to be a clear framework, and in my view, from the FAA and DOT, from a safety perspective as well. One big issue in my mind, and it's not really clear to me this is yet a regulatory issue, but it could become one, is drone safety. And one of the big concerns is in the aerospace business, having come from the manned spaceflight world, I know that manned spaceflight program comes from a military standard environment. There's a saying that aerospace specs are built on blood. And the idea is that when you fly on an aircraft, you're clearly flying a vehicle that conforms with certain safety standards, certain levels of reliability, maintainability, et cetera. I'd like to get on my Southwest airline flight that has 5 nines reliability and not 2. Well, it begs the question, what does that mean for a drone flying overhead over a populated area? Is 3 nines good enough? Is 5 nines good enough? Does it require legislation to make that a standard? I tend to bristle at the idea of over-regulating, but on the other hand, I want to be thinking that I'm not going to be reading about drones on the cover of Popular Science 15 years from now, again, like the hydrogen economy. I'd like to think this is here and now. So I'm of the view that the market is not going to be restricted by innovation or technology. I'm pretty confident, based on what I'm seeing, that's going to be a solvable problem. What I'm a little bit more hesitant about is I'd like to have kind of a clear national standard for all 50 states on what that might be. And again, it's safety, it's reliability, it's the quality of commercial drones. Do we expect that to be military grade? Well, in some cases it makes sense, in other cases not. Now, what do we apply to hobby grade drones? And you certainly know the Washington, D.C. area is a restricted airspace. And you may or may not have heard about the aircraft that they suspect was struck a drone. I think it was a Mexican jetliner. It's an open question about whether that's the case or not. So safety is a big issue, and it'll just take one accident to bring everything to a stop. And that's my worry. So how do you manage the hobbyist world versus the commercial operators? This is an open question in my mind.
Is that an area that someone is working on, or are these just questions at this point that need to be addressed?
I know from a safety perspective and a national airspace perspective, I do know the FAA is working on that, and there are task forces involved in doing that. I'm raising it more from the perspective, not as a policymaker, but as an investor. And when I talk to other investors, we're making a representation of what we think the market risks are. So imagine an entrepreneur seeks capital, and we're willing to take a risk. We're also working with other angels and other VCs explaining, hey, here's our understanding of what we think the technical risks are, what we think the market risks are. And oh, by the way, there's a couple of regulatory issues here you should be aware of. And oh, by the way, there are some acts of God, acts of man that we can't control that could essentially freeze the whole business. So I try to disclose as many of the risks as I possibly can. So the more things we know about a particular venture, the better grasp the investors will have. There's a certain class of investors that get drawn to this, and the more information they have about what the regulatory outlook is, the better. You think about it this way, investors have choices, and investors can invest in a software deal that may have a 3-5 year horizon, or there could be an alternative. So if they're looking at a drone deal, one of the open questions is, hey, is there precedent for having made money? And if so, under what circumstances? And this particular sub-asset, this particular sector require more time to develop, more capital to develop than, say, your typical software startup. It's an open question.
So do we need more standards for the hardware? Or do adequate standards exist now?
There are some standards, but there's this kind of, and it's not unlike what we're seeing in analog in the low Earth orbiting satellite area. If you think about it, and let me just draw this parallel. If you look at some of the what I call the big iron satellites, those were born out of, I'll call a military pedigree at one point in time. Those are military grade, mil-spec sorts of technologies. There's now a new commercial class of low Earth orbiting satellites that are entrepreneurs. They're using commercial off-the-shelf technology. They're building constellations to have certain expected on-orbit constellation lives. And then you get to the next level below that, which is the hobbyists who are flying experiments. And, essentially, who knows what standard is being applied when you fly a rack on the International Space Station for a device. And there's no one size fits all. And I think we have probably an analogous situation going on in the drone side. And I don't want to be overly dramatic because for me, I think the way I try to convey risk, and certainly in the case of low Earth orbiting satellites as an analogy, I tend to think of it as the maturation of mainframes to your cell phone. The idea is to have a device that's ubiquitous and consumer grade. That's not unlike what happened in the satellite area, and that's probably not unlike what we've seen in the drone area as well with Predators. That was born out of the mil-spec, that sort of environment, a different kind of ruggedized vehicle for a different mission versus the quadcopter and extreme case. I have, just for a reminder's sake, I keep in my office a Radio Shack drone, and the point of the vehicle is to remind myself that is little more than a toy quadcopter. I'm not advocating a one-size-fits-all standard, and I do know there are various bodies working on this. But from an investor perspective, and that's the hat I tend to wear, I'm asking the question, what is an appropriate level of regulation that gives comfort to attract the capital market to get behind a venture so that at some point in time they can create a profitable entity? And the currency and trade that we deal with are companies that ultimately exit. So these companies either become public or in most cases are acquired. Acquisition is a far more common way of investors exiting their opportunities. So I deal with the kind of investors that are interested in not only making a difference, but also economics. These have to be sustainable ventures at some point in time.
Are these questions that you would typically work with entrepreneurs so that they can justify to the market that their products are safe over the long term? Or is it part of a broader industry situation?
It's a great question, and it's at the heart of how one diligences a company. We know that in some cases with entrepreneurs, we know that entrepreneurs are salespeople at the end of the day, and that's we expect it, right? Because they're passionate about what they do, they're excited about their mission. And, we've seen a lot of scenarios where, we've seen risk in different form and maybe bring a different perspective to the company. So when I get into a business plan with an entrepreneur and I try to understand the technology, I get a sense of whether I think there's a value proposition that's strong or not. If I think that's the case, what I will do, I will bring the company in with subject matter experts as well as my investment team. And between the two of us, we'll look at the company from a whole series of angles. It'll be a technical angle, market angle, management team perspective, regulatory questions. And we'll drill down further and we'll ask ourselves a question, do we think this sort of company could be successful with our investment committee, the body that ultimately makes the go, no go decision? And when there's an open question, you will never get complete confidence that we've got the answer. As you might imagine, the earlier you get into a newer investment area, the more frontier risk you're going to have. It's just the nature of the animal. So in the case of a regulatory question, I will call a professional society such as AUVSI. I'll talk to people at the local chapter. I'll speak to folks at our Center of Excellence. I might even speak to folks in academia or the National Science Foundation. And I try to get to the bottom of what a particular reg might be, what a market outlook could be. It's entirely fine that a market is nascent. But if the market is a puddle right now, I do want to hear an argument that says, hey, it may be a puddle now, but here's the growth rate to suggest why this particular device is entering into a ripe market now, and here are the conditions. So we're looking for the entrepreneur to build an argument, and we try to poke holes in it, knowing that there's no such thing as a perfect plan at any point in time. And we're also looking for a degree of entrepreneurial flexibility too. We know plans change, market conditions change, and we're looking for a certain class of entrepreneur that has the ability to, you've heard the word overused, pivot. And pivoting means a lot. It has a different meaning in my mind when you're dealing with a medical device or bending metal or an airframe than it does software. So if you have to do a do-over with software, well, it's ones and zeros and you recode it. And I'm not trivializing the importance of that, but if you have to redo an airframe or a propulsion system, it could have a very different consequence. So, we think about that with the capitalization of a company. So these companies tend to be, and I don't want to say this is always the case, with hardware involved, and this is true for investors in general, professional investors, they look at hardware a little bit differently than software. And that colors the thinking of a lot of investors. There's a certain class of investors that will never touch hardware. All they want to see is data or analytics or ones and zeros. We're not afraid of that. We certainly have our share of software. We have one of the bigger cyber portfolios in the country, if I'm not mistaken, perhaps the largest one. And we're asking a whole series of other questions when you have platforms that have both hardware and software. So if you have a drone, guess what? If you have some sort of comm link to it, it is now a new attack surface. And it begs the question, gee, if a black-hatted hacker got involved in the comm link somehow, what nefarious things can be done? And so that takes you down a whole different set of risk questions. And so we're trying to find a place where we can at least be aware of the risks and find out what risks we can get to the bottom of and which ones are just systemic to the venture. This is kind of a unique asset class. I'll say that. And I would also say that it reminds me a little bit of energy investing. Clean energy investing 10 years ago, there were a whole group of software investors that got into clean tech and learned some very expensive lessons. And I think that's a byproduct that they didn't understand the asset. I think to play in the UAS, the drone world, I think you have to understand some of the complexities involved with, again, MIL standards, regs, metal bending, and then the classic questions about, is there a market? And can this entrepreneurial team do what it takes to adapt to shifting market conditions and shifting technical needs? It's a challenging thing, and that's what makes it exciting too.
What do you look for in an entrepreneur?
So to me, these are immutable qualities. We're looking for people who are passionate, but also can be sober-eyed and realistic about circumstances and can kind of pick themselves up by the bootstrap when they've got bad news. I'm looking for someone who can bounce back. I'm looking for someone who's committed, quite frankly. If something goes wrong, I want to make sure that person is not going to bail. I want to make sure this person is going to do everything in their power to go from plan A to B. Oh, and quite frankly, if there's not a good alternative, I want somebody who's very kind of sober-eyed and realistic about what's going to happen and what can happen with the company. We're looking for integrity. You might imagine the moment you take your money or mine, congratulations, you're a fiduciary. And with that comes some prudent behavior. We're looking for risk managers. We're looking at people who are going to be good stewards of capital. Now, I'm not saying we want people to be timid and not take risks, but we are looking for clarity on use of proceeds. We want to know that the entrepreneur is making judicious decisions. We also want to know, hey, can the entrepreneur sell? Quite frankly, I don't know if you've seen this scenario or not, but I've seen no shortage of cool widgets. But in my view, the entrepreneur not only has to sell the product or service, but they have to be able to sell the company. And if you think about it, you're raising money, you're selling the company. And that's an even greater abstraction than selling product or service. So we're always asking ourselves the question, hey, if this person is able to sell product or service, there may be a decent chance this person can sell the company. But you know what? If they can't sell product, how can they possibly sell the company? That's an attracting an investor kind of question. And that's sort of one of the most essential skill sets of being an entrepreneur is the ability to raise capital. It's all time consuming. It's a full-time job.
I want to go back to drone security for a moment, just to make sure that we covered everything.
What colors my thinking a little bit is that we have a fairly large cyber portfolio on our software side. And we also have a Mach 37 cyber accelerator. And the reason I bring that up in this context is I no longer look at these flying devices as just flying devices doing whatever requirement or mission they're intended to do, but I also think about vulnerability. If you're talking about a fixed IoT device, an Internet of Things device, for example, on a grid network, you're thinking about ways to harden that, or at least I would think the utilities have been thinking about how to protect against back channels, et cetera. The same thing goes for flying IoT. So when I'm thinking about a drone, when I'm thinking about a low Earth orbiting satellite, I'm asking the question, and this is back to this question of what standard, what degree of ruggedized comm links do we have here to protect against a backdoor? Is there a persistent backdoor by design, or has the coder cut corners, and is there an unexpected vulnerability for an adversary? You can drive yourself crazy thinking about these things, but you got to be thinking about that. That's part and parcel, in my view, one of the responsibility areas for the entire industry, which is, hey, we have a higher imperative here, which is we not only have to make sure this thing works, but we also have to be reasonably sure that we've taken some prudent steps to make the engineering on this compliant with some minimum standard of safety. And, they'll get back to these open questions. What is that standard? I do not have a crisp answer on that, but it is an area that I do think about because it's inevitable that it's going to happen if it hasn't happened already in the unmanned aerial side. And we certainly know of inadvertent strikes. I'm just wondering about deliberate strikes in a commercial setting. That's a source of concern.
I imagine that from your perspective, that would be a good area for a company to focus on.
Most definitely. And I know there's some entrepreneurs already thinking about that problem set, as well as some established companies doing the same. But I think there is clearly, in my view, there's clearly an opportunity set. And there's still a lot of fluidity in the engineering. There's still some fluidity in the regs. There are the use cases here for operations are still open. I mean, think about safety as well. We haven't really talked about quadcopters, and this isn't getting into the question of security per se, but I'm thinking about proximity to people and proximity to valuable assets. If I have a quadcopter near a technician in a cherry picker and he is near a high voltage line, how do I know that quadcopter is not going to make contact with either the operator or the asset? And it's a big question in my mind, which is, do we have a class of drones that are expressly designed for close proximity, co-location near humans, expressly with the design of not doing harm and being kind of a flying Roomba, a vehicle that could be safe for users, quiet? I mean, there's some examples of that in the market. I've seen a few already. I think that's an example of a nascent market that's not yet really crisply defined. My sense is that there is an untapped market there. The green eye shade investor in me says, hey, this is great. The gut is fine, but let's see evidence that customers really need this. So one of the areas, back to safety, back to cyber, what have you, one of the questions at the end of the day will be, my opinion will only matter so far, but what really will matter the most is there someone out there, an institution or consumer, whoever the target market is, who is willing to write a check, and not just one, but repeatedly, to buy this product? And we've seen one-offs, but we'd like to see some sort of evidence. So the stronger the proof, if there's a cyber argument there, I'd love to see it. I think there's a story there. I'd also like to know, hey, have they been talking to certain avionics companies? Have they been talking to certain airframe companies? Who have they been talking to validate that the market is big or ready or getting there and has the potential to get there? And I like to say to some of the guys I work with, letters of intent or LOIs become LOLs if there's no teeth to them. And we like to see proof that somebody's going to really enter into an economic engagement with the entrepreneur. So we're looking for proof, even if it's little bits of proof. No one wants to be in a stranded investment. They want to see that the customer wants these things. And I think that's the burden now on the entrepreneur. There's now a higher bar to say, this is a cool widget, and that's great. But right now, you got to cross a threshold. And the threshold is confront the marketplace with your widget and tell us what they like and dislike. And that's huge. That's hugely valuable. And it gets back to your question about entrepreneurs. I love an entrepreneur that does that. An entrepreneur that says, hey, I took my cool widget, I went to the marketplace, I spoke to 100 customers, and 90 of them said it sucked 10 of them said, you know what, it's not so bad if you do a couple of tweaks. That feedback loop is hugely valuable because it now says the investor's money is not being used for a hunting expedition. It's now being used to perfect that product market fit. It's being used to capture more customers. It's being used to kind of align a product that people care about versus a cool pipe dream. So to me, that's kind of a real big quality. And it's an intangible, but it's a quality I look for in entrepreneurs now.
What are some of the next steps for the Center for Innovative Technology?
One area that is very large to the Center of Excellence, it's critical, is there's a question about if you're an entrepreneur, one of the hardest things to do is get to the bottom of what industry customers are buying and why. So, for example, whether you're a co-op or a larger utility like a Dominion versus VDOT, Virginia Department of Transportation, there are just so many multitudes of uses. And one pattern seems to be emerging, which is I'm not so clear that a lot of these operators want to develop a competency and build up their own aerospace operating unit. I think they would rely on third-party vendors, engineers, contractors, for example, to do emergency response, disaster recovery, so forth. So what this organization, this new CIT Center of Excellence, is doing is organizing, galvanizing customer requirements by state and corporate, small, medium, and large. And I think the ambition is to create a directory of sort of sources and uses of this technology. So I almost think of it as kind of a fledgling marketplace. We're really trying to get a sense of who's buying and why. So if you are that NASA Langley spin-out entrepreneur, chances are you're going to have a very narrow field of view of what your market opportunity is. And the idea here is to create a wider aperture on what at least statewide opportunities are. And our idea is, hey, if this works out, we think this is an area that we can provide leadership to much of the Mid-Atlantic, if not the nation, because in my manner of thinking, this could be a really interesting way of creating these kind of master common requirements for small companies to make better informed business plans. So that's one big area. And another, of course, is advocacy. Back to this concept of political subdivisions. I do know they are involved in making sure, lobbying, I don't think is the right word, but I think shaping with policymakers, whether it's the General Assembly or the executive branch, there's an educational role, but essentially we want to make sure that people are heading towards this broader national aerospace concept. So we're doing what we can within the border of Virginia, and we believe working with groups like AUVSI at the national level, we can expand that message. And my hope is that the diligence we bring to this will bring up a better class of entrepreneurs that are investment grade.
So what do we need to know to facilitate that evolution?
I think the laws of business physics and entrepreneurship remain unchanged, even though there are some unique risks and challenges in this sector. To me, I think the blocking and tackling in this asset class is still, at the end of the day, very similar that we'll see in other sectors. And investors have, if you're a high net worth individual, you have decisions to make with your after-tax dollars, right? And, this type of entrepreneur has got to be better, that software entrepreneur who's also asking for capital. And I think the entrepreneurs I've seen who are in the sector are capable of doing that. So my manner of thinking is, hey, at the end of the day, there's a lot of brilliant innovators. They're all over the world. They're in Eastern Europe, they're in Asia, you name it. They're everywhere. In my manner of thinking, the differentiation at the national level will be this policy regulatory side, and on the venture entrepreneurship side, it'll be building really solid entrepreneur DNA companies that really know how to build world-class companies. I think that's, and this is not pablum, I really believe that. I think we need that kind of entrepreneur that's got to be a winner, and I'd love to be able to showcase that.
So in short, what would be a recipe for a successful investment?
I don't think there's anything mysterious about this space. I think it kind of boils back down to the basics. We're going to look for a good quality team or the ability to get there, a good sized market or the ability to get there, a potentially disruptive innovation, evidence that people will buy this stuff, the ability to attract capital, and a crisp understanding of how to get around certain safety, regulatory, et cetera, hurdles that are in front of these entrepreneurs. So it's a tall order, but I think this is nothing new under the sun.
And for my final question, Marco, what message would you like to leave in regard to the Center for Innovative Technology and the drone industry?
I believe that we're in a unique position to really build high growth, high expectation companies in this particular sector. And my message to entrepreneurs would be to surround yourself with really top flight people, especially advisors that you can lean on, who can tell you about the industry, but also, quite frankly, be able to communicate to your investors, to be able to communicate to regulators, to be able to communicate to your market. In my view, I like to have a certain class of entrepreneur who can talk beyond the widget and the innovation, and that's great, but be able to frame what they're doing in a really clear, crisp, compelling business argument that just gets people super excited. So it's blocking and tackling, surround yourself with excellent people. And I think if you manage those kind of risks, you'll attract capital. It's my view that that's the kind of entrepreneur that we want to have succeed. We want people who know how to survive and able to endure. And that's kind of the excitement of being in this business.
That's it for episode 193 of the Drone Radio Show. I hope you enjoyed hearing from Marco Rubin of the Center for Innovative Technology. I want to thank Marco for taking the time to speak with me.
This has been the Drone Radio Show
more
podcast.
About the Center for
more
Innovative
information
Technology,
on today's show can be found on our website at www.droneradioshow.com. If you're using drone technology for business,
Drone Radio Show,
fun,
please
or
consider
research,
supporting the
and would like to
podcast
share
with a
your
small
experience
donation.
on the show,
The
please
content
visit
is
our
always
website
free,
and fill out a
but for
guest
as little
appearance
as $1,
application.
you can help
And don't
defray
forget
the
to
cost
follow
of
us on your
production.
favorite social
To donate,
media channels.
go to droneradioshow.com/donate or patreon.com/droneradioshow. And thanks for listening. Your support means a lot to me, and I hope you'll listen to more episodes of the Drone Radio Show podcast to hear how others are using drones for business, fun, and research. For the Drone Radio Show, I'm Randy Goers.